Do you think you know the history of the 20th century? Are you sure that World War I was the main event that redrew the world map and reshaped humanity's consciousness? We were all lied to. We were made to watch shell explosions and political upheavals to distract attention from something far more terrifying and global, from an event that virtually rebooted human civilization. Have you ever heard of encephalitis lethargica? Most likely not, or perhaps only briefly, as a strange medical curiosity. But what if I told you that it wasn't just a disease? What if it was the largest-scale operation to switch off the consciousness of millions of people, which official history shamefully calls an epidemic, to conceal traces of artificial intervention? Imagine a blood-curdling scene. The year is 1916. The world is engulfed in the flames of war, but in the rear, in the peaceful cities of Europe, and then across the entire planet, something inexplicable begins to happen. People simply fall asleep. This is no ordinary sleep. It's a state in which a person turns into a living statue. They breathe, their hearts beat, they can swallow food if fed, but their minds, their wills, their souls are as if unplugged from the socket. Millions of people worldwide suddenly turned into unconscious bio-robots. Official statistics, which, as we know, cannot be trusted, speak of 5 million dead and millions more who never fully woke up, remaining in a vegetative state for decades. But consider for a second. 5 million people at that time. That's a colossal number. That's the population of several European countries. And these people didn't just die from an infection. They were erased from reality. Their consciousness was blocked. Why do history textbooks remain silent about this? Why are we told about every battle, every peace treaty signed, but kept in the dark about the fact that a third of the planet's population at that moment was in a state of altered consciousness or deep coma? The answer is simple and terrifying. It doesn't fit into the official worldview, because it shatters the linear chronology of development. If you start to compare the facts, you will see a frightening pattern. The sleeping sickness epidemic began precisely when the old world was collapsing. The Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, all these giants fell precisely during this period. Coincidence? In the world of grand politics and global governance, there are no coincidences. A strange disease, turning people into docile, spineless puppets, appears precisely at the moment when the old order needed to be broken and a new totalitarian and controlled world built. Doesn't it seem strange to you that the virus, or what they present to us as a virus, acted so selectively? It didn't strike the lungs, nor the heart. It struck precisely at its target, the human brain, specifically the part responsible for will and consciousness. It was a lobotomy on a planetary scale. Let's look at the symptoms more closely. Doctors of that era were in a panic. They had never seen anything like it. People froze in the most unnatural poses and could remain in them for hours, days, weeks. This is called catatonia. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the immobility. The most terrifying thing was in their eyes. Survivors described their state as captivity. They heard everything, understood everything, but couldn't even move a finger. They were trapped in their own bodies as if in prison cells. Who could have created such a perfect prison for the mind? Nature? Or those who possessed technologies we are forbidden to know about? Recall that precisely at this time, in the early 20th century, there was a sharp leap in the development of radio communication and electromagnetic technologies. We are used to thinking of radio as music and news, But what if the first global towers, installed all over the world, transmitted more than just Morse code? What if 1916 became the year of the first global experiment in influencing the human brain with frequencies? Look at the photographs from those years. Look closely at the faces of people on the streets of cities in the 1920s. Haven't you noticed that after this epidemic, the world seemed to have been replaced? Architecture changed, art changed, people themselves changed. Before the war, before this strange sleeping sickness, we see inspired faces, complex architectural forms, incredible attention to detail in clothing and daily life. And afterward, an era of primitivism, concrete gray boxes, and uniform thoughts began. As if someone pressed a reset button, erased the files of high culture, and uploaded a simplified version of humanity's operating system. Those who woke up after encephalitis lethargica often changed beyond recognition. Children became aggressive. Adults lost their moral compass. These were no longer the same people who had fallen asleep. They were empty shells, ready for new programs to be uploaded. And the new programs were not long in coming. Revolutions, dictatorships, the Great Depression. All of this fell on the fertile ground of a society that had just experienced global psychological trauma. Official science calls the pathogen an unknown virus. But here's the paradox. The virus was never found. In 100 years of medical development, with our microscopes and genetic analysis, scientists have never been able to isolate the agent that put millions to sleep. They tell us, well, it just disappeared, evaporated. Do you believe that? A virus that mowed down people in droves suddenly decided it had had enough and vanished into oblivion in 1927. That sounds like a fairy tale for naive children. That's not how it works in biology. If there's a pathogen, it remains in the population, it mutates, it returns. But the sleeping sickness disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, as if someone had flipped the switch on a generator. Or, conversely, turned it on to a different power. We are on the verge of a monumental discovery that could overturn your perception of reality. What if I told you that the epidemic never ended, that it simply transitioned into another, hidden phase? But to understand this, we need to go back in time and dismantle every cog of this monstrous machine of will suppression. We must ask questions that historians are afraid to ask. Who was truly behind the scenes of this process? What technologies were applied? And why did survivors recall strange visions that were identical for everyone, as if they were being broadcast the same movie? Are you ready to learn the truth about how they tried to put us all to sleep and why they almost succeeded? It only gets more interesting from here. Let's set emotions aside and look at the cold, hard facts that would make any analyst's hair stand on end. The official version states that encephalitis lethargica is a viral disease. But here's the first blow to that house of cards built on lies. The epidemiology of this disease absolutely does not follow the laws of virology. Imagine an overcrowded barracks where soldiers sleep shoulder to shoulder. One falls ill and slips into an endless sleep. By the logic of any infection, be it flu or typhus, the entire barracks should be down within a week. But this did not happen. One person would fall ill, while their neighbor remained perfectly healthy. The virus was not transmitted from person to person airborne, as they describe it to us. Outbreaks occurred synchronously in London, New York, Vienna, and Siberia, as if on command from an invisible conductor. This is not the behavior of a biological agent. This is the behavior of a signal, or the consequences of a global dispersal of a substance that settled unevenly. Recall that precisely during these years, from 1915 to 1918, humanity for the first time in history massively employed chemical weapons. Tons of chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas were released into the atmosphere. We are told that the gas dispersed on battlefields, but the Earth's atmosphere is a closed system. Where did these thousands of tons of neurotoxins go? They didn't just vanish without a trace. They rose into the upper layers, mixed with air currents, and fell as invisible precipitation onto peaceful cities. And here's a strange coincidence. The symptoms of poisoning by certain nerve agents and the symptoms of encephalitis lethargica are frighteningly similar. Damage to the central nervous system, impaired signal transmission from the brain to muscles, stupor. What if sleeping sickness was not nature's punishment, but the first global chemical poisoning in history, which authorities decided to disguise as a mysterious virus to avoid responsibility for an ecological catastrophe of planetary scale? Let's turn to the medical reports of that time, gathering dust in archives. The famous Viennese physician Konstantin von Economo, after whom the disease would later be named, performed autopsies on the deceased and discovered something that defied comprehension. The inflammation was localized. It affected the gray matter of the midbrain, specifically the hypothalamus. For those not well versed in anatomy, let me explain. This is the control panel for our consciousness, sleep, and wakefulness. As if a sniper had shot precisely at the point that makes a person an active creator, turning them into a passive observer. The lesions were so specific that they resembled surgical intervention at a cellular level. Natural viruses usually act more crudely. They cause general inflammation, meningitis, swelling. Here, however, we see a delicate disabling of higher functions. Who or what possesses such precision? Now, compare demographic maps. Where were the strongest outbreaks? In industrial centers, densely populated cities, at key transportation hubs, where population density was highest, where potential resistance from hungry and war-weary masses needed to be suppressed. People were turning into living statues. Have you seen the newsreels? A person would freeze with an arm raised, mouth open, mid-stride. This is not merely sleep. This is a glitch in the body's control matrix. Doctors described cases where patients could catch a ball thrown to them, automatically, reflexively, but were unable to answer a simple question, like, "What is your name?" A disconnect between body and personality. The body functioned like a mechanism, while the personality was blocked. Isn't this the dream of any totalitarian regime? The ideal slave who can perform mechanical work but is incapable of asking, why, and for what reason? During this period, another strange phenomenon occurred, about which historians are silent. A sharp change in the statistics of mental illnesses. After the epidemic ended in the 1920s, mental institutions worldwide were overflowing. But not with those who had slept. Rather, with those who had endured the illness on their feet. Their personalities changed. Respectable family fathers became aggressive psychopaths. Modest women lost their sense of shame. Children stopped learning. Doctors threw up their hands. Post-encephalitic syndrome. But if we look broader, we see a mass degradation of the population's cognitive abilities. The level of intellectual discourse in newspapers and literature before 1916 and after 1925 is like night and day. Texts became simpler, music became more primitive, art moved into abstraction, as if humanity's IQ was forcibly lowered by 20 points. Did you know that many of those who fell asleep in 1916 only woke up 10, 20, or even 30 years later? Imagine their horror. They closed their eyes in a world where empires existed, where people wore frock coats and rode in carriages, and opened them in a world of concrete, radio, jazz, and totalitarian leaders. For them, only one night had passed, but for the world, an entire era of complete reshaping had unfolded. These people became living fossils, witnesses to how quickly and harshly reality had been replaced. Their testimonies were dismissed as the ravings of madmen, but precisely in their words lies the key to the puzzle. They said that during their endless sleep, they didn't just see darkness. They were in a strange space where they were shown other worlds, where they felt a presence. Collective hallucinations? Or a connection to a unified information network that was reprogramming their consciousness while their bodies lay motionless in hospital beds? We are approaching a line beyond which official science is powerless. Why didn't medications work? Why was the only thing that offered any help decades later drugs that affected dopamine, a neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and will? This means that people were robbed of their will. Chemically or through wave technology, they were deprived of the most crucial human quality: the ability to act independently. The sleeping sickness epidemic was the perfect cover for a paradigm shift in the governance of humanity. The old world didn't just need to be destroyed by war. It needed to be erased from memory. And what could be more effective than switching off witnesses for 10 years while the scenery changes? But this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you think only humans suffered, you are deeply mistaken. Archives contain data about strange animal behavior during those same years, about mass livestock deaths without visible cause, about birds losing their navigation. This was an impact of planetary scale. And if it was a weapon, who held their finger on the button? The trails lead not to the general staffs of warring countries, but much higher, to where not battles for a patch of land are planned, but battles for the very essence of human nature. We have reached the most ominous part of this puzzle, where history, technology, and demographics collide in an insoluble contradiction. If you think the sleeping sickness epidemic was a random glitch in human biology, then how do you explain the phenomenon of empty cities? Look at photographs of world capitals taken between 1916 and 1920. Paris, London, St. Petersburg, New York. Huge avenues, magnificent buildings, but not a soul on the streets. Historians feed us tales about the long exposure of old cameras, claiming that moving people supposedly disappeared from the film. But this is a lie for schoolchildren. These pictures clearly show shadows from trees, flags fluttering in the wind, even clouds. Yet there are no people. Where did the millions of inhabitants go? They weren't at the front, as even neutral cities are deserted. The answer is frightening in its obviousness. The population was locked down, either in quarantine barracks or in their own homes, plunged into an artificial, lethargic sleep. It was precisely at this moment, while humanity was in a state of forced pause, that the most massive technological substitution in history occurred. Consider this. Before 1914, the world ran on steam and coal. Horsepower was primary. And suddenly, as if by magic, within 5 to 7 years, while the world writhed in the agony of war and sleeping sickness, perfect internal combustion engines, aviation, radio communication, and the electrification of the entire planet appeared. Who built these factories? Who developed the blueprints? Who operated the machines if men were fighting in the war and millions of civilians were in a lethargic sleep? The official version of wartime economic mobilization is falling apart. It's impossible to make a technological leap 100 years ahead in 1 decade with a depleted and ailing population. Unless these technologies were introduced from outside, already developed, while the old population, Remembering a different way of life was conveniently switched off. Let's talk about the so-called Spanish flu. We are told that the flu claimed between 50 and 100 million lives right after the war. Very convenient, isn't it, to blame all the deaths on the flu? But the symptoms of the Spanish flu and encephalitis lethargica often intertwined. What if the Spanish flu was a cover-up operation? A way to dispose of those whose brains couldn't withstand reprogramming, or those who didn't succumb to the sedating signal? Doctors of that era were confused by diagnoses. A person might fall into a coma from encephalitis, but their death certificate would state influenza. This was a grand cleansing of witnesses from a past era. Millions of people, carriers of old culture, traditions, and perhaps a completely different memory of the past, were simply wiped off the face of the earth. And those who remained were either too scared or too young to remember the truth. But the most terrifying evidence lies in the fate of those who did survive, but remained in a statue-like state. In 1969, Dr. Oliver Sacks gave such patients an experimental drug, levodopa, and they woke up. After 40 years of sleep. What happened next should have been a global sensation, but it was quickly forgotten. These people awoke young on the inside. They thought it was still 1920. They hadn't aged mentally. But their reaction to the modern world was telling. They saw something alien, mechanical, soulless in us, the people of the late 20th century. They said the world had become dead, despite the abundance of machines and lights. But most importantly, after a short time, the drug stopped working, and they turned back into statues. As if the system realized there had been a leak and flipped the switch again. This proves that their condition was artificially maintained. Their brains were intact, their personalities were alive, but some external blocker prevented them from controlling their bodies. We are all batteries, and in the 20th century, our polarity was simply reversed. Look at the architecture. Before the years 1918 to 1920, palaces were built with 17-foot ceilings, with stucco, with arched windows that could not be manufactured by hand. After the Great Sleep, we began building Khrushchev-era apartments and concrete boxes. Where did the masters go? Where did the blueprints go? Where did the schools of architecture go? They fell asleep and never woke up. Knowledge was removed. Humanity was left with only the necessary minimum to service oil rigs and factories. We live on the ruins of a more advanced civilization, one that was destroyed not by atomic bombs, but by a quiet, sweet slumber. We are the descendants of those who were primitive enough to survive this purge, or those who agreed to accept the new rules of the game during the reboot. Now ask yourself, why is it precisely now, in our time, that there is renewed talk of unknown viruses affecting the brain? Why are they trying to drive us back into our homes? Why are neurointerface technologies and chip implantation developing at such a frantic pace? The century-old scenario is repeating itself. Then, they tested global shutdown through chemistry and radio waves. Now, they have the internet and 5G. Encephalitis lethargica has not disappeared. It's simply waiting for a new command. Those people, the millions of sleeping beauties and princes of the 1920s, were discarded material in the eyes of the architects of the New World Order. They were used as biomass for an experiment to separate soul and body, and the experiment was deemed successful. We walk, we work, we consume, but have we truly woken up? Or is our reality merely a collective dream imposed on us after true history was erased in 1917? Now that we have grasped the scale of the technical and historical falsification, let's peer into the darkest abyss of this tragedy, into the part that concerns not buildings and machines, but our very souls. Have you ever felt an inexplicable melancholy gazing at old photographs or passing by majestic 19th century buildings? Have you felt a strange sense of loss, as if you've forgotten something incredibly important, something that made life vibrant and meaningful? This isn't just nostalgia, it's the phantom pain of humanity's amputated memory. We are all children of those who survived the great lobotomy of the 20th century, and we carry in our genes the fear and emptiness of that terrible time. Imagine the horror of a mother in 1920. Her son, young, strong, full of hope, returned alive from the front, but one morning simply did not wake up. He breathes, he feels warm under the blanket, but his gaze is fixed on emptiness. She feeds him with a spoon day after day, year after year. She tells him news he doesn't hear. She watches his muscles atrophy, how life slips through her fingers. And there were millions of such mothers. It was a torture of hope. The authorities said, "Wait, medicine will soon find a solution." But there was no solution. There was only cold observation. Imagine the colossal amount of pain and despair generated in those years. This collective trauma changed the very psychosphere of the planet. We became fearful. We became submissive. We learned to value only basic survival, forgetting about high aspirations, because anyone who tried to fly too high was shot down or put to sleep. This epidemic created an ideal generation gap. Knowledge, traditions, the true history of a lineage. All of this is passed from parents to children through living communication. But what if the parents are asleep? What if an entire generation of mentors was switched off from reality? Children growing up in the 1920s and 30s became cultural orphans. They were easy to manipulate. Any ideology, any false history could be uploaded into their empty minds. This is how the Soviet man, or the ideal consumer in the West, is created. These are people without roots. They don't know who built the cities they live in. They don't know where the technologies they use came from. They are ideal cogs in a system that fears only one thing: the awakening of memory. Think about the term human resource, which came into common use precisely in the 20th century. Before that, a person was God's creation, an individual. After the sleeping sickness epidemic, we became a resource: oil, coal, people.
We were equated with fossil fuels. We were counted, weighed, and put into processing.
Encephalitis lethargica showed the elites that human consciousness is not a gift from above, but simply an electrical circuit that can be disconnected. This discovery unleashed the most monstrous social engineers. Concentration camps, mass repressions, forced psychiatry. All of these are direct consequences of that experiment. If 1 million people can be switched off and no one is punished, then anything can be done to people. We ceased to be inviolable. We became livestock on a farm where the owners sometimes conduct a culling. Are you not outraged by the fact that this tragedy is presented to us as a medical curiosity? They tell us, it happens, nature is cruel. But this is a lie, designed to conceal the crime of the millennium. Look at the statistics for depression and chronic fatigue today. Chronic fatigue syndrome is the scourge of the 21st century. Doctors cannot find the cause. What if it's an echo of that very signal? What if the towers that put our great-grandparents to sleep are still operating, just at minimal power, keeping us in a state of semi-slumber? We're not exactly sleeping. We go to work, watch TV shows, but we're not living life to the fullest. We lack the energy for rebellion, for creativity, for creating a new world. We just function. We are held on a short energy leash. We are left with just enough strength to get to the factory floor or the office, but not enough to understand who we truly are. This doesn't just evoke sadness. It should evoke rage. Our potential was stolen from us. We could have already colonized other planets, lived for 150 years, possessed telepathy or controlled matter. Judging by the remnants of antediluvian technologies, our ancestors were close to this. But we were thrown back into the Stone Age of consciousness, given iPhones and credit cards in return.
We were deceived, given a surrogate instead of real life. The great sleeping sickness didn't end. It mutated into social apathy. Look around. How many people live on autopilot? Their gaze is dim, their movements mechanical. They are the direct heirs of those victims of 1916. The zombie apocalypse has already arrived. It's just that in movies, zombies eat brains. And in reality, zombies obediently live according to someone else's schedule. But the most terrifying thing about this story is that we've accepted it. We've normalized this imposed drowsiness. We think it's natural to be tired of life by the age of 30, that not remembering history beyond our grandfather is normal. We've forgotten what it means to be truly vibrant, clear-minded, and free. We've been convinced that we are small people, from whom nothing depends. But this is the biggest lie. If we were so insignificant, why would so much effort and resources have been spent on putting us to sleep? Why spray chemicals, build towers, falsify history? It means there is a power within us that they fear to their core, a power capable of knocking down their house of cards in an instant. Look at official science, which smugly declares that we use only a small fraction of our brain's capabilities, and 90% of our DNA is supposedly junk. Do you really believe that nature, this brilliant architect, would create a complex biological computer only for it to run at idle? This is a thinly veiled lie. These dormant genes and neurons are not evolutionary defects, but blocked functions. These are the very abilities for telepathy, self-healing, and direct control over reality that we were deprived of during that 20th century operation. We were turned into bio-robots with limited functionality, made to believe that the limit of our dreams is a mortgage and a Friday night in front of the TV. But even in this semi-conscious state, we managed to create masterpieces, to love and to empathize. Imagine what we are capable of if this limiter is removed. We are not a herd that needs a shepherd. We are sleeping gods who have been indoctrinated into believing they are mortal slaves, dependent on pills and instructions. This is precisely why the modern information landscape has become so dense and intrusive. Have you noticed how unnaturally time has accelerated? The endless stream of news, flashing images, a succession of events. This is not just chaos. It's more like a thick veil, white noise that distracts us from something truly important. As if the environment itself is trying to drown out the questions we've started asking more and more frequently. The effect of that long-ago historical oblivion is gradually weakening, and our collective intuition is beginning to break through the layers of years. The old worldview no longer seems so convincing, and to maintain the illusion of familiar reality, civilization is forced to constantly accelerate its pace, not giving us time to reflect. The threat to established dogmas lies not in loud arguments, but in silence and personal awareness. In that very moment when a person suddenly stops amidst the hustle, looks around, and clearly understands, something doesn't add up here. This inner epiphany cannot be undone, and the more people begin to notice these inconsistencies in the official version of history, the harder it becomes to maintain the old scenery, which seems about to collapse under the weight of the unfolding truth.